Amanda Silver, and welcome to Crash Course History with
Nicole,
Mitra, Napoli,
Jacob Hoffman.
Today, we will be focusing on three major topics, and all three of these topics had a huge impact on how America was shaped in the late 1800s and early 1900s. These three topics are the Gilded Age, robber barons or captains of industry, and immigration. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive in. Well, you might ask me, hey Amanda, what really was the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age was a point in time during US history that ran roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s. The term comes from Mark Twain, who originally said, sure, everything looks golden on the outside, but underneath that thin layer of sparkle, there are some
Serious problems.
During this time, cities grew like crazy, businesses boomed, and the US became an industrial giant. But at the same time, workers faced long hours, unsafe conditions, and low wages, all while the rich got enormously richer. Now, while all of this is happening in the East, what was happening in the West? Let's talk about westward expansion. While the East had industry booming, the West was going through many changes of its own. The East was industrializing, the West was expanding. And there were both upsides and downsides to this expansion. Transportation and trade also got a huge boost as railroads stretched westward. On the positive side, people found new land to farm, new jobs were created, and new towns popped up across the country. But there were some major negatives too. Native Americans were kicked off their homeland, and the environment suffered as natural resources were overused. And lastly, conflicts increased as settlers and railroads pushed farther west. So while everyone was sprinting west like it was some long-distance TikTok challenge, inventors were back home in the lab like, LOL, y'all are still using candles? In 1879, Thomas Edison transformed daily life by introducing long-lasting electric light. This invention didn't just brighten homes, it powered factories, extended workdays, and brightened cities after dark. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell brought us the telephone. Hello? This completely changed the way that people communicate. Suddenly, you could talk to anyone, anywhere, instantly. This meant no more sending a letter, waiting 3 weeks, and then realizing that the reply you got basically just says, "Okay." Humanity got a total upgrade. In 1903, the Wright brothers invented the very first plane. This totally revolutionized travel as we know it today. And in 1888, George Eastman created the first ever handheld camera. And we learned all about the inventions in class. Thank you, Miss Bogey. Let's talk about how big business leaders took over entire industries in order to create a monopoly, because they definitely had a strategy. There were two major strategies into creating a monopoly during this era: horizontal or vertical integration. Here's an easy way to remember them. If you can't beat them, buy them. From start to finish, keep it in your business. At the same time as all of this was happening, thousands of African Americans, called the exodusters, left the South and headed for places like Kansas. They were escaping violence, unfair sharecropping, discrimination after the war, and were looking to become farmers and landowners. The exodusters were primarily led by Benjamin Pap Singleton, former slave and abolitionist who organized groups in the South to make the journey to Kansas. The Homestead Act made this possible by giving free or cheap land to settlers who were willing to farm it, which gave them a chance at rebuilding and creating a new life. Their journey shows just how far people were willing to go to find real freedom and get real opportunities. So while the exodusters were packing up and heading to Kansas, determined to start fresh and finally get some real opportunities, something major was happening in the country. Enter the Transcontinental Railroad. Basically, America said, what if traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast didn't take 6 months, 2 broken wagon wheels, and multiple emotional breakdowns? Boom. Railroad time. In 1869, the first train could go all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. The Transcontinental Railroad made travel faster, trade bigger, and helped more people travel and move west. But building this railroad was really hard. Chinese immigrants did much of the work, which was very dangerous, and many of them faced unfair treatment. The building of this railroad also affected Native American communities who were forced to move out of their homes as settlers and railroads moved and expanded west. This is a reminder that while the railroad really helped America expand west, it also had many unfortunate consequences that really truly affected the people that were already living there in the West.
America in the late 19th and early 20th century was a land of raw ambition and capitalism. It was an age gilded, coated in a thin layer of gold, masking what lay beneath: capitalism and stark inequality. It was known as the era of the robber barons. A robber baron, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a person who has become rich through rootless and unscrupulous business practices, originally with reference to the prominent U.S. businessmen in the late 19th century. Robber barons were industrialists who became extremely wealthy and used unethical tactics to crush their competitors. Their aims were not just to gain profit, but total domination. Let's take J.P. Morgan, for example. Morgan joined the New York financial industry in the 1850s. He founded J.P. Morgan & Co. banking firm that became a success by financing the formation of Federal Steel. However, J.P. Morgan built his empire not through the fairness or innovation, but by crushing his competitors along the way. His ruthless consolidations left similar businesses with no chance of survival. He manipulated markets and rapidly increased his wealth while ordinary Americans suffered through economic instability he helped create. His empire was built on power, exploitation, and the belief that one man should command the economy of an entire nation. And there was also Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in history. He started small, ferrying passengers in the New York harbor. But then he built a shipping empire and shifted his gaze to a new frontier of wealth, railroads. In building his railroads, Vanderbilt eliminated rivals, manipulated stock prices, and created a monopoly so vast it linked Chicago and New York under one name, his name. Vanderbilt had a simple strategy: create a monopoly, then squeeze the competition until they had no choice but to sell him control. This is also an example of vertical integration, which we learned with Bespogi.
Speaking of vertical integration, next we have the one and only Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie transformed the steel industry in the United States. The Carnegie Steel Company made manufacturing steel faster by constructing plants all over the country. He also utilized vertical integration by owning raw materials as well as railroads and ships for transportation. While he may seem like a robber baron so far, Andrew Carnegie was actually considered a captain of industry. A captain of industry is a person who manages a large business company. Captains of industry had a more positive connotation than the robber barons did, and their word was usually associated with people who extended their work into philanthropy as well. In 1901, Carnegie decided to sell his steel empire for more than $200 million. He used this money to build the New York Public Library and the Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is now known as Carnegie Mellon University. He also founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Lastly, we have John D. Rockefeller, who is considered both a captain of industry and robber baron. Rockefeller was an industrialist who started the Standard Oil Company in 1870. He drove competitors out of business, forcing them into debt and bankruptcy, and in the process, built the monopolistic Standard Oil empire. The working conditions for his employees were brutal. The hours long, the pay low. After he retired, Rockefeller turned to philanthropy. He donated over $80 million to the creation of the University of Chicago before his death. In addition, he helped create the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which was later renamed Rockefeller University. He donated more than $530 million to many causes before his death in 1937.
Now, on to immigration in the Gilded Age.
For most of the history of the United States, immigration has been a key factor in growth, technological advancement, cultural diversity, and labor. So during the Gilded Age, millions of immigrants sought out America in hopes of pursuing this American dream. However, depending on where you were from, your experience could differ drastically.
Chances are, if you're a European immigrant, you entered through Ellis Island. Ellis Island was opened in 1892 in the East Coast off the New York Harbor and was active all the way until the 1950s. Over this time period, it processed over 12 million immigrants. These immigrants came from all over Europe, consisting of Irish, Russians, Germans, Italians, Jews, and more.
The immigration process was typically relatively straightforward, and most times it only took a couple of hours. And so immigrants would be questioned on topics like occupation, literacy, their background, and then they would undergo a medical inspection before entering the United States. So with this, Ellis Island became a symbol of hope, with the Statue of Liberty welcoming in immigrants with the opportunity of freedom.
Now, if you were an Asian immigrant, more likely than not, you entered through Angel Island, an immigration checkpoint and gateway off the coast of San Francisco. This island operated from the 1910s to 1940, and many called it the Ellis Island of the West. But boy, they could not be more wrong.
So while Ellis Island primarily focused on processing immigrants, Angel Island was more about filtering immigrants out. So immigrants that arrived in Angel Island were faced with harsher interrogations, long detentions, and strict attempts to limit their entry. And some immigrants were reported to have been detained for weeks, months, or even years. In 1882, the U.S. banned Chinese laborers from immigrating to the U.S. for 10 years and revoked citizenship from current immigrants. The common argument for this anti-Chinese sentiment was that the Chinese immigrants were occupying too many jobs in the American West, and so this economic competition heightened tensions and resulted in hate crimes like lynching and large riots. And so as a result, Chinese immigrants were forced out of their homes and practically isolated from the rest of society.
This ban was extended into 1892 and made permanent in 1902, and was finally repealed by the Magnuson Act in 1943 in an attempt to ease tensions with China during World War II.
Aside from immigrants from Europe and Asia, there was also some immigration happening within North America, such as Canadian and Mexican immigrants entering the United States.
That's right. Canadians, especially French Canadians from Quebec, immigrated to the United States to work in New England's textile mills as industrial laborers. They typically chose to live in their own bubbles, inhabiting concentrated areas primarily occupied by other Canadian immigrants. Later on in the Gilded Age, an influx of skilled workers arrived in the United States at the cost of what historians call a brain drain, or a lack of skilled workers back in Canada.
Mexican immigrants were drawn to the United States to escape post-Mexican Revolution poverty and violence, and they filled railroad building and agricultural jobs. However, like many other immigrants, they worked as unskilled and low-wage workers and were crammed in segregated neighborhoods called barrios. And so immigrants from Mexico primarily entered from the El Paso and Texas, and by the 1930s, the Mexican-American population had actually tripled.
While the Gilded Age seemed like a flourishing and golden time for economic growth and industrial success, when we examine the behind the scenes of the time period, we see that the impoverished continued to fall through the cracks and that immigrants were mistreated and discriminated against despite relocating to America to pursue the American dream and a better life. Thanks for watching Crash Course Kids, and we'll catch you next time.